those of you who don't know him, he is the Swedenborg Society's executive director and the museum director. He oversees the Society's publishing and museum exhibition and events programming. He's edited and published several books, thank you, on Swedenborg, some of which are available, maybe all of which are available on the table in the back. And during 2010, he was the producer of a documentary on Swedenborg commissioned by the Society, Heaven, Hell, and Other Places, which some of you may have seen last night at our cinema session. The same year, he curated an exhibition of international artists as part of the Society's 200th anniversary entitled 14 Interventions. And this included work by Ian Sinclair, Brian Catlin, Jeremy Deller, and Bridget Smith, from whom you'll be hearing shortly, as well as others. And during his time as the museum director, he set up the Swedenborg Archive in print, and that's the Artist in Residence program and the Swedenborg Short Film Festival. There are many other things I could say about Stephen, someone who's done so much in his capacity as Swedenborg Society's director, but I think we'd better hear from him instead of me.
Today, essentially, what I was hoping to raise was this notion of modes of practice, or modes of practice within contemporary art, and with a particular emphasis on the nature of contemporary. And essentially, I'm just going to offer some personal thoughts on the manner by which I think we can identify Swedenborgian ideas in contemporary art practice. So I'm going to say something about the general theoretical view of contemporary art practice. And then after that, I'm going to try and draw attention to the curatorial practice that we've developed in the Swedenborg House. And essentially, I'm just going to raise three examples. One is the artist Jeremy Deller. The other one is the writer Ian Sinclair. And I'm going to close with a very brief mention of exhibition, the latest exhibition curated by Bridget and myself, titled Now It Is Permitted. Now, I don't know if everybody there knows what Swedenborg House is or where we are, but we're based in London, and we're the oldest publisher in the world, proudly so. We have a wonderful archive, library, collection of rare artifacts, and the exhibitions that we host, film festivals, are in some way an encouragement to allow people to engage with the process or the material that is Swedenborg in its various cultural, artistic, or historical forms. Now, Humera, who just spoke, I can't see unfortunately, is our current president, and Bridget, who's about to follow, is our current artist in residence. So far, the overall project that we've initiated there has been incredibly successful, and if nothing else, it just confirms, if confirmation is needed, that Swedenborgian thought continues to offer significant inspiration for creative practice today. Anyway, to move a little bit closer to the theme, I'd like now to raise a few questions. So how might we understand, how might we best understand Swedenborg's place within contemporary practice? Essentially, how does it fit in? How might we recognize it? And how does this presence differ from historical practices in the past? Well, there's quite a few answers. They're big questions, but I think in general, the first and most obvious difference is the general context by which artistic practices are discussed and operate in general. And I'm just going to give it, for example, if you imagine that during Swedenborg's time, during the 19th century, and even early 20th century, the dominant discourses within art were related to aesthetics. And in the 18th century in particular, the 19th century, that discourse was dominated by Kant's notion of the sublime and beautiful and the question of taste. Now, as we know, Kant was a reader of Swedenborg, if a critical one. But after Kant, we also find issues related to symbolism, abstraction, by Mallarmé and Baudelaire, among others. Again, we find a Swedenborgian presence there. with the concept of correspondences. And again, through Baudelaire, we find the notion of the aestheticization of the artist, etc. The emergence of the ready-made. I don't believe there's a Swedenborgian connection there. In the US, as I'm sure you've already found out via Emerson, we have notions of self-determinancy, correspondence between moral code and nature. And this list could go on and on. And we come right up to Jorge Luis Borges. And I feel all of these things have been adequately discussed at this conference, so I'm not going to go into that anymore. So what I would say is, while these various examples are widely divergent, they do share a common characteristic. They're joined by the assumption that the artwork is realizable, external object, thing, and this thing follows, or it's imbued with essentially representational, aesthetic, or symbolic values. And by this I mean that our participation with the object is based on an expectation of shared taste and a shared recognition of artistic form. I hope that's relatively accurate. I'm sure there's much more that could be said about that. But what I'm going to do now is to try to explain how today it's precisely these expectations of the artwork as defined as having shared characteristics or aesthetic characteristics that we can read that's shifted, that's no longer present. So for better or worse, moved away from issues related to representation. We've moved away from issues related to symbolism, and even the question of the aesthetic has gone. And by that I mean we no longer expect issues of beauty or the sublime to be a necessary component of how we appreciate a work of art. Indeed, I would even say that we no longer even need the object of art itself to. So what do we move to instead? Well, predominant themes within contemporary art include notions of participation, of embodiment, of the artwork as a mode of relations. We find an emphasis on artistic process. Multiplicity would be a key term. And in many cases we find that the artists, rather than making a work, encourage us to enter an intellectual or physical landscape. And this encourages activities such as installation art, sound art, etc., performance art. And in none of these examples is the art object a necessary feature. Now, I realise everything I've just said is probably fairly obvious, and I hope I'm not being over-pedantic. But what I essentially want to say is that this shift in artistic practice, which has opened up a whole new, I would say, incredibly fertile ground for the development of Swedenborgian thought. And I would also say that regardless of whether these ideas occurred as a consequence of Swedenborg's work, and regardless of whether the artists themselves are aware of any of these connections, key Swedenborgian ideas can be identified very strongly and are indeed being explored in multiple ways in contemporary art practice. Now, I hope that was relatively clear. I'm going to shift the focus now a little bit to the two examples I mentioned at the beginning, and the manner by which I hope to be able to indicate elements of what I've just said in projects that they've hosted at Swedenborg House. The first is a performance and a screening stage by artist Jeremy Denner. Now, Jeremy is often described as a conceptual or video or installation artist or many other ways. He rose to international fame, I think, when he won the Turner Prize back, not sure when it was, back in 2004, 2005. But the element I'd like to draw attention to here is the collaborative nature of his work, and it also draws upon this notion of the artwork as a community event. So, to go back to the event that he hosted or he organised at Swedenborg House, it involved, to begin with, the screening of a short video, which was displayed on a very small monitor in the corner of our big hall. Jeremy gave a short talk. He also made a limited edition poster, and I was given the rather onerous task of DJing on the night on a small CD player, which had very mixed results. And the documentation of the event was subsequently exhibited at the Cabinet Gallery alongside other memorabilia from Sweden House. Now, the primary reason why I raised Jeremy as an example here is that in helping Jeremy with his research before the event, we spoke very specifically about Swedenborg's concept of communities in the spiritual world and how they are gathered or constructed according to various states of individual. And he appeared to be particularly drawn to this notion that within the spiritual world, our individual identities are drawn and subsumed within a collective identity, and that all subsequent activities or deeds or words exist then within the collaboration of that community. Now, if anyone has kept track of Jeremy's work, they'll know that these ideas of community and collaboration are fairly intrinsic to his entire artistic process, and are therefore offer, I think, a significant contribution as to how critical theories, even future historians, might begin to view his work. Anyway, to return to the event of Swedenborg House, the key element in was the interaction between two invited audiences, namely the Swedenborgian community, or the Swedenborgian community that I was able to invite via Swedenborg House, and the contemporary art world, or the contemporary art world that Jeremy knew in particular. So in a sense, it was an entirely private event with invitations sent to these two collectors. And his aim, I believe, was to create a connection between the distinct group identities and shared affections. The artwork in this case, therefore, did not reside in the video, nor the talk, and happily not in the music that I played. The artwork instead was given form in the interaction between the people. The audience, therefore, were both the spectator and the artwork. They were in the embodiment of the intention. So the key point I'm trying to say here about Jeremy is that the artwork for him only ever exists in a collaborative process. And that within this sense of community and collaborative progress, there's also a critique of the traditional notion of the self, the subject, which again, I believe, informs very neatly with Swedenborg's notion of the proprium and how this operates within the spiritual. Now from this, I would very gently segue into how these ideas are also found in the work of Ian Sinclair, and especially a project he did at Swedenborg House in 2010, which was subsequently published in a book called Several Clouds Colliding. And again, Christian collaboration was a strong feature of this project. Ian is known to be a long-standing reader of Swedenborg, and Swedenborg occurs in many of his early books from the 1990s. He's also known to be a key practitioner of something called psychogeography. I don't know to what degree psychogeography has reached the US, but in outline it involves an artistic tracing or transformation of space through a creative mapping of psychological place. Or in other words, our environment is a reconstruction of our psychological relationship to it, and not the reverse. So it's distinct in this sense from what we understand as traditional travel writing or architectural critique, because it always begins essentially from the standpoint of the subject. And the relationship that then subsequently unfolds offers a series of layerings or artistic layerings in which the subject sees herself or himself constantly reconstructed in the place in which they find themselves. Now, those of you familiar with Swedenborg's spiritual diary or his Heaven and Hell will probably recognize that this corresponds closely to how Swedenborg describes the relationship between thought and the environment in the spiritual world. In his Last Judgment in particular, and if I remember correctly, I think it's section 48 or around that part, he offers a very interesting statement which goes something like this. I haven't got it to hand, but hopefully those amongst you who have got the book can check it out afterwards. Is that progression in space takes place according to our internal states, and that the paths that we choose in the spiritual world are simply the boundaries of our own thought. Now, whenever I read that, I find it an absolutely amazing statement. And taken in the context of working within the parameters of psychogeographers or those writing today who deal with notions of place and space, it's quite a profound insight, and it could even be used as a motto. They could put it as a slogan on their t-shirt. Now, it's precisely this particular element, this particular statement that Ian adopted in his project at Swedenborg House. He selected a series of objects, one of them a plaster cast of Swedenborg's skull, another one a typewriter, and then he underwent a process of reinventing the space through the written text. And I suppose, in short, the aim was to reconstruct an entirely new mapping of the building of Swedenborg House as a mental or psychological space. Now, for those who wish to visit Swedenborg House one day, and I hope you do, many of these texts and objects are still on display. And if anyone is interested again in what Ian did in particular, you'll find it all published in a book called Several Clouds Colliding. Now, the key points again that I'd like to draw attention to with regard to both Ian and Jeremy is that neither of them would call themselves Swedenborgian artists, and neither of them are particularly interested, I would say, in being seen as representing a particular ideological or intellectual framework of thought. But what we see, on the other hand, is a kind of opening up of the artwork as a network of possibilities, or a psychological landscape, if you like, that can be entered and inhabited by both the artist and the audience. So we see a move away from the question of aesthetics, of technical expertise, of representation, and all of those traditional but also wonderful notions, but we find instead, and much as we find in Swedenborg's discussion of the spiritual world, an interest in the relations between people and things, or the manner or the way in which intentions are realized through activities. And it's these relations, I would suggest, especially in the notions of community and the way we encounter both a Swedenborgian sensibility, that we also find a space that makes possible a very clear Swedenborgian interpretation of contemporary art. Now, I would hesitate to say, as Emerson once did, that the age is Swedenborg, but I would perhaps say without reservation that within the current artistic climate, within London and the UK at least, we encounter an incredibly rich domain for Swedenborgian possibilities. And for those of us who work in a professional sense within a Swedenborgian framework, if we can grasp and encourage and facilitate this interest, then I think it bodes well for facilitating more conferences such as this at the very least. Now, I'm going to close, and on a final note, and by way of introduction to Bridget, who comes next, our very latest exhibition at Swedenborg House was staged as a poster exhibition entitled Now It Is Permitted. And it was staged last October and included contributions from over 40 artists, writers, filmmakers, intellectuals, and various other people. Homero was included in that show. Homero's daughter, Chloe Regis, was also included in that show. We had artists such as Fiona Banner, Cornelia Parker, Marina Warner, Gavin Turk. And the premise of the exhibition, or following Swedenborg's famous phrase, as we all know, comes from True Christian Religion, that was written above the door of the New Jerusalem, now it is permitted. The premise was to invite individuals to offer their own visionary axiom, which the individual felt was most needed today. And these axioms were then collected by Bridget and placed on posters and designed by Bridget with the help of Fraser Muggeridge and displayed across the walls at Swedenborg Hall. So each poster offered a different visionary slogan which when taken together offered again something like a new community of voices, all distinct and all variable, but all operating on the basis that the visionary possibility or visionary perspective of the world was not only needed, but was possible and was being offered. Now, Bridget, of course, has to take huge credit for the success of this event. Not only did she co-design the posters, as I just mentioned, but she coordinated the various artists and writers and individuals, and she also spent a lot of time hanging the show. So on this note, I think I'm going to come to a conclusion. I'm going to say thank you for listening.